The document in my hands was impossible. Yet there it was. My signature on a quitclaim deed, transferring my father's 200-acre farmland to some company I'd never heard of. The problem? I never signed it. I sat in my Manhattan office, staring at the papers my lawyer had just delivered. 3 months after my father's death, someone had stolen the land that had been in our family for 60 years. "Amora, are you certain you didn't sign this?" my lawyer asked gently. I laughed bitterly. I think I'd remember signing away $4.2 million worth of property. The signature looked perfect. Too perfect. Every loop and curve matched my handwriting exactly. But I knew the truth. I had never, ever signed those papers. My father, Jude Winslow, had died of a heart attack 6 months ago. The land in upstate New York was all he left me. It wasn't just property, it was my childhood, my heritage, my future security. Someone had forged my name and stolen everything that mattered. As I studied the signature more closely, a terrible suspicion began to form. Only one person had seen me sign documents enough times to copy my handwriting this perfectly. My ex-fiancé, Brandon Cross. 2 years earlier, Brandon and I were planning our wedding. He was everything I thought I wanted: charming, successful, and ambitious. As a managing partner at Crossfield Capital, he moved in Manhattan's highest financial circles. I was a financial analyst then. Quiet and overlooked in meetings while men like Brandon commanded attention. He seemed different, though. He noticed me, valued my insights, made me feel special. "You're brilliant, Amora," he'd say after I solved problems others couldn't. "Don't let them underestimate you." When he proposed at his Hamptons beach house, I said yes without hesitation. We were perfect together, I thought. Both of us understood money, property, and power. But then my father got sick, and everything changed. Brandon became distant when I started spending weekends upstate, caring for Dad. He complained about cancelled dinner plans and missed networking events. "Your father has nurses," he'd say coldly. "You don't need to be there every weekend." But I did need to be there. Dad was all the family I had left after Mom died when I was 12. The land meant everything to him. He'd fought developers for decades, refusing every offer to sell. "This land has history," he'd tell me. "Promise me you'll never let them take it." I promised. I had no idea someone was already planning to break that promise for me. Dad died on a Tuesday morning in October. I held his hand as he passed, whispering that I'd protect our land no matter what. Brandon flew up for the funeral, playing the supportive fiancé perfectly. He charmed the neighbors, helped with logistics, and seemed genuinely caring. But I noticed small things. How he studied the property boundaries. How he asked detailed questions about zoning laws. How he made notes in his phone during conversations about the land's potential value. The county's talking about rezoning this whole area for commercial development, old Mr. Peterson from the neighboring farm told us after the service. "Your dad's land could be worth millions if that happens." Brandon's eyes lit up, though he tried to hide it. After the funeral, we went through Dad's papers together. Brandon was surprisingly helpful. Organizing documents and making copies of everything. Just being thorough, he said when I commented on his attention to detail. "You'll need all this for the estate transfer." 3 weeks later, he broke off our engagement. "I'm not ready for marriage," he said over dinner at an expensive restaurant. "We want diff errant things." I was devastated but not entirely surprised. I'd felt him pulling away for months. What I didn't realize was that he'd already gotten what he wanted from me. The breakup hit me hard. I threw myself into work, trying to forget Brandon and focus on my career transition into real estate legal consulting. I barely thought about the upstate property. Dad's lawyer had assured me the estate transfer was straightforward since Dad had left everything to me in a properly notarized will. The land sat empty through the winter. I planned to visit in spring, maybe fix up the old farmhouse, decide what to do long term. Then came the phone call that changed everything. "Miss Winslow, this is Tom Bradley from Cascade Development. We're interested in purchasing your property in Ulster County." I was confused. "I'm sorry, but the land isn't for sale. Actually, according to our records, you transferred the property to Pine Ridge Holdings 3 months ago. We're negotiating with them for purchase." My blood went cold. That's impossible. I never transferred anything to anyone. "I have the quitclaim deed right here, signed by you on November 15th. November 15th. The day after Brandon had helped me organize Dad's papers. I hung up and immediately called my lawyer. Within hours, I was staring at the forged document that would haunt my nightmares. Someone had stolen my inheritance, and I was beginning to understand exactly who. I spent the next week investigating Pine Ridge Holdings. It was a shell company registered in Delaware, with no real business address or public information. But I had advantages that most victims of fraud don't have. I understood corporate structures, knew how to trace financial connections, and had contacts in the banking world. More importantly, I was angry. Not just upset or disappointed. I was furious in a way that made my hands shake and my vision sharp. Someone had violated my father's final wishes. They'd stolen my security, my heritage, my future. They'd done it while pretending to love me, to support me through grief. I called Naomi Glass, my godmother and one of the few people I trusted completely. She was a forensic document examiner, though I'd never had reason to use her professional services before. "Bring me the original," she said after I explained the situation. "And bring samples of your real signature from DIFF errant time periods." "Naomi, I think I know who did this." "Don't tell me yet," she said firmly. "Let me examine the evidence first. Assumptions can blind us to the truth." But I already knew the truth. Brandon Cross had spent 2 years studying my handwriting, learning my patterns, practicing my signature. He'd used my grief and trust to position himself perfectly for theft. Now I was going to teach him what happened when you stole from the wrong woman. Naomi's findings confirmed my worst fears. Under magnification, the signature showed clear signs of forgery. Hesitation marks where someone had paused to match my writing style, slight tremors that indicated copying rather than natural signing. "This is sophisticated work," she said, adjusting her examination equipment. "Whoever did this had extensive samples of your writing and considerable skill. How do we prove it in court? We'll need the original notarized deed your father left. Do you know where it is?" I nodded. Dad had mentioned keeping important documents in a safety deposit box at the local bank upstate. I'd been putting off dealing with it, too emotionally drained to face more paperwork. "There's something else," Naomi said. "The notary stamp on this forged deed. It's fake. The registration number doesn't match any licensed notary in New York State." My heart pounded. This wasn't just signature forgery, it was a complex fraud scheme with multiple felony violations. I drove upstate that weekend, visiting the old farm for the first time since Dad's funeral. The empty house felt haunted, but I forced myself to focus on the task ahead. At the bank, the safety deposit box contained exactly what I hoped: the original deed in my name, properly notarized, with documentation proving my father's clear intention to leave me the land. I also found something unexpected: a handwritten letter addressed to me. "Amora, if you're reading this, I'm gone. This land is your birthright. Never let anyone convince you to give it up." I sat in that empty bank vault and cried. Back in Manhattan, I began building my case methodically. But I also started researching Brandon and Crossfield Capital more carefully. What I discovered made my blood boil. Crossfield specialized in acquiring distressed properties, often using aggressive tactics to pressure owners into selling below market value. They had a pattern of targeting elderly farmers, widows, and people facing financial difficulties. Brandon's specialty was charm. He'd wine and dine property owners, gain their trust, then structure deals that heavily favored Crossfield while appearing generous on the surface. But my situation was different. This wasn't aggressive negotiation, it was outright theft. I found records showing that Pine Ridge Holdings had already begun the process of rezoning my father's land for commercial development. Brandon's plan was becoming clear: steal the property, get it rezoned, then flip it to developers for massive profit. The projected value after rezoning was over $8 million. He'd stolen my father's life work to make himself rich. I needed help, and I knew exactly who to call. Elijah Rhodes had been my colleague when I worked in traditional finance. He'd left banking 2 years ago to start his own boutique firm, disgusted by the corruption he'd witnessed. He'd also had feelings for me that I'd never reciprocated, being engaged to Brandon at the time. "Amora," he said when I called, "I heard about you and Brandon. I'm sorry. Don't be. I need your help with something bigger than a broken engagement." Elijah met me at a quiet cafe in Midtown. When I explained the situation, his expression grew darker with each detail. "That bastard," he muttered. "I always knew Brandon was dirty, but this is criminal. Can you help me investigate Crossfield's other deals? I think this might be part of a larger pattern." Elijah leaned forward. "Amora, what exactly are you planning?" I met his gaze steadily. "I'm going to get my land back. And I'm going to make sure Brandon pays for what he's done. Through legal channels. Through every legal channel available to me." Elijah smiled grimly. "Good. Because I've been waiting years for someone to take down Brandon Cross properly." Over the next hour, he outlined what he knew about Crossfield's questionable practices. Shell companies, forged documents, bribed officials. Brandon's firm operated more like a criminal organization than a legitimate business. "The problem is proving it," Elijah said. "Brandon's careful. He has layers of protection, expensive lawyers, powerful connections. Then we'll have to be more careful than he is." Elijah studied my face. "You've changed, Amora. You seem harder. Grief and betrayal will do that to a person." "Good," he said. "You'll need that hardness for what's coming." As we parted ways, Elijah squeezed my hand. "I'm with you on this. Whatever you need." I walked back to my office feeling something I hadn't felt in months: hope. My first move was defensive. I couldn't get my father's land back if Brandon managed to sell it first. Using my knowledge of property law, I filed a lease pendens against the Pine Ridge Holdings transfer, effectively freezing any sale while the ownership dispute was being resolved. Brandon called me within hours. "Amora, what the hell do you think you're doing? Protecting my property from thieves." "Your property? You signed it over to Pine Ridge months ago." "Funny thing about that signature, Brandon. I never actually signed those papers." There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Colder, more calculated. "You're making a mistake. That's a legally binding document with proper notarization. You'll lose in court and pay my legal fees on top of it." "We'll see about that." After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. Brandon's reaction told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't surprised by my accusation, wasn't confused or defensive the way an innocent person would be. He was angry because I'd figured out his scheme. That afternoon, I received a call from Cynthia Vale, Crossfield's corporate attorney. "Miss Winslow, I represent Pine Ridge Holdings in this matter. We're prepared to offer you a settlement to resolve this dispute quickly. What kind of settlement? $100,000 cash, no admission of wrongdoing, and you withdraw your lease pendens. I almost laughed. They were offering me $100,000 for land worth over $4 million. Counteroffer, I said. Return my land immediately, and I won't press criminal charges for forgery. The line went quiet. Then, we'll be in touch. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my father, about his fight to keep the land, about the promise I'd made to protect it. Brandon had counted on me being too grief-stricken and too trusting to question the transfer. He'd expected me to accept the theft passively. He'd underestimated me completely. I spent the weekend researching every aspect of Crossfield Capital's business. Their other shell companies, their development partners, their financing sources. What I found was a web of interconnected fraud that went far beyond my stolen land. Crossfield had used similar tactics on at least 6 other properties in the past 3 years. Elderly owners who died shortly after mysterious property transfers. Widows who couldn't afford to fight expensive legal battles. Brandon had been running this scheme for years, and no one had been able to stop him. But I wasn't a grieving widow with limited resources. I was a financial professional with specialized knowledge and growing fury. Monday morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, reporting suspected mail fraud, wire fraud, and forgery in connection with Crossfield Capital. The second was to the New York State Attorney General's OFCE, requesting an investigation into predatory practices targeting elderly property owners. By lunchtime, I'd also filed complaints with the Securities and Exchange Commission about Crossfield's shell company structure and potential money laundering. Brandon wanted to play hardball. I'd show him what hardball really looked like. The legal machinery moved slowly, but I wasn't waiting for official investigators. I had my own investigation to conduct. Elijah proved invaluable. Using his industry connections to gather intelligence on Crossfield's operations, he discovered that Brandon had been bragging about the Ulster County deal at banking conferences, describing it as a masterclass in creative acquisition. He's not even trying to hide it, Elijah reported. He sees it as a business success, not a crime. Meanwhile, I began researching the zoning board members who would decide my land's commercial development status. 3 of the 5 members had received substantial campaign contributions from developers associated with Crossfield. This wasn't just property theft, it was systematic corruption. I also discovered something interesting about the land itself. My father had been smarter than I'd realized. In the 1970s, he'd fought a previous development attempt by getting the property partially designated as historically significant farmland. The designation included restrictions that would make commercial development much more difficult. Brandon's people had either missed this detail or assumed they could overcome it with enough political pressure. They were wrong. I hired a historical preservation lawyer and began the process of strengthening those protections, making the land essentially undevelopable regardless of zoning changes. If Brandon wanted to steal my property, he'd discover he'd stolen something worthless for his purposes. But I wasn't done. I was just getting started. My godmother Naomi called with disturbing news. Someone had been asking questions about me around the neighborhood upstate. A man in an expensive suit, claiming to be doing due diligence on a property purchase, she said. But Mrs. Patterson said he seemed more interested in you personally than in the land. Brandon was investigating me, probably looking for vulnerabilities he could exploit. 2 could play that game. I hired a private investigator to conduct surveillance on Brandon and his associates. What we discovered was fascinating. Brandon lived far beyond his official income. The Hamptons beach house, the Manhattan penthouse, the collection of luxury cars, none of it made sense on a managing partner's salary, even a successful one. He's either hiding income or spending money that doesn't belong to him, my PI reported. We also discovered that Brandon had been having an affair with Cynthia Vale, his corporate attorney, for over a year. The affair had started while he was still engaged to me. I felt a moment of hurt, then realized something liberating. I was completely over Brandon Cross as a person. My feelings now were purely about justice. The personal betrayal had been painful. But the theft of my father's land was unforgivable. I began documenting everything we learned, building a comprehensive file on Brandon's financial irregularities, questionable business practices, and personal misconduct. If he wanted to make this personal, I'd show him just how personal things could get. But my real weapon wasn't going to be scandal or embarrassment. It was going to be the law, applied with surgical precision. I spent 3 months building my case before making my next major move. When I finally acted, it was with overwhelming force. First, I filed criminal complaints with local prosecutors in every county where Crossfield had operated questionable deals. Each complaint included detailed evidence of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Second, I filed civil lawsuits against Brandon personally, Crossfield Capital, and Pine Ridge Holdings, seeking not just the return of my land but punitive damages for the trauma and legal expenses they'd caused. Third, I contacted every victim of Crossfield's previous schemes, offering to share my research and legal strategies. Within a week, Brandon was facing criminal investigations in 4 counties and civil lawsuits from 8 different errant property owners. The media noticed. Investment firm accused of systematic property fraud, read the headline in the Wall Street Journal. Manhattan banker charged with forging dead farmer's daughter's signature, reported the New York Post. Brandon's carefully constructed image was crumbling in real time. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Cynthia Vale filed motions to dismiss every case, claiming I was orchestrating a vindictive harassment campaign against her client. Miss Winslow is clearly motivated by romantic revenge rather than legitimate legal grievances, she argued in court papers. The strategy backfired spectacularly when Judge Miles Tanner reviewed my evidence. These are serious criminal allegations supported by substantial documentation, he said during a hearing. The plaintiff's romantic history with the defendant is irrelevant to the question of document forgery. Brandon sat in the courtroom looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The FBI investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Federal agents raided Crossfield's offices on a Tuesday morning, seizing computers, files, and financial records. By afternoon, the story was everywhere. Federal agents raid Manhattan investment firm in fraud investigation. Crossfield Capital under federal investigation for property scheme. Brandon's other victims began coming forward publicly. An 82-year-old widow in Albany whose farm had been stolen after her husband's death. A veteran's family in Buffalo who'd lost their ranch through forged documents. The pattern was always the same. Identify vulnerable property owners, forge transfer documents, flip the land for massive profits. My case was just the most recent example of a scheme that had been running for years. Elijah called me that evening. Have you seen Brandon's assets? What about them? They're being frozen. Federal asset forfeiture. The government thinks everything he owns was purchased with proceeds from fraud. I felt a moment of savage satisfaction. The Hamptons house where he'd proposed to me, the Manhattan penthouse where we'd planned our future, the luxury cars he'd used to impress clients, all of it was being seized. Brandon was learning what it felt like to lose everything that mattered. But I wasn't done with him yet. The criminal case would take years to resolve. I wanted justice faster than that. I wanted to destroy him the same way he'd tried to destroy me, by taking away his future. While federal investigators built their criminal case, I launched my own strategic campaign to dismantle Brandon's business empire. My first target was Crossfield's investor base. Using my financial analysis skills, I researched every pension fund, insurance company, and wealthy individual who'd invested money with the firm. Then I began making phone calls. This is Amora Winslow. I'm calling to inform you about serious legal issues involving Crossfield Capital, where your money is currently invested. The conversations were always similar. Initial skepticism, followed by shock as I outlined the evidence, then panicked questions about how to recover their investments. Within 2 weeks, Crossfield was facing massive redemption requests as investors fled. Brandon called me, his voice shaking with rage. "You're destroying innocent people's livelihoods. Crossfield employs 50 people who've done nothing wrong. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you started forging legal documents. Amora, please. We can work this out. I'll give you the land back, plus compensation for your trouble." "It's too late for that, Brandon. You made this personal when you stole from my dead father." I hung up and immediately called my next target, the New York State Banking Commission. It was time to attack Brandon's professional licenses. Investment advisors like Brandon required state licensing to operate legally. Those licenses could be revoked for criminal behavior or ethical violations. I filed detailed complaints documenting Brandon's fraudulent activities, including sworn statements from multiple victims and copies of forged documents. The Banking Commission moved quickly. Within a month, Brandon received notice that his licenses were suspended pending investigation. Without those licenses, he couldn't legally manage other people's money. Crossfield Capital was finished. The dominoes fell faster than I'd anticipated. Once Brandon's licenses were suspended, Crossfield's remaining clients demanded immediate return of their funds. But there was a problem: much of the money wasn't there. Elijah's sources inside the financial community reported that Brandon had been using new investor money to pay returns to existing investors, a classic Ponzi scheme structure. "He's been insolvent for at least 2 years, Elijah told me. The property thefts were desperate attempts to generate real assets." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Brandon hadn't just stolen my land out of greed, he'd stolen it to avoid complete financial collapse. My father's property was the collateral holding up Brandon's house of cards. Federal investigators reached the same conclusion. They filed additional charges against Brandon for securities fraud and running an unlicensed investment scheme. The man who'd once been Manhattan's golden boy was now facing decades in federal prison. But I still wanted my land back, and the legal process was moving too slowly for my taste. It was time for the final phase of my plan. I'd spent months attacking Brandon's business and reputation. Now I was going to hit him where it would hurt most: his ego and his sense of control. I was going to beat him at his own game, using tools he'd never expected me to master. Real estate development wasn't just about money, it was about relationships, political connections, and understanding how power really worked. Brandon had taught me well during our relationship, probably better than he'd realized. Now I was going to use everything he'd shown me against him. My research into the Ulster County political landscape revealed something interesting. The zoning board chairman, who'd been receiving contributions from Brandon's development partners, was up for re-election. His opponent was Maria Santos, an environmental lawyer who'd been fighting commercial development of historic farmland for years. I made a substantial contribution to her campaign. I also discovered that several other board members were vulnerable to public pressure. Their positions were appointed, not elected, and the county executive who appointed them was sensitive to environmental concerns. I organized the other property owners who'd been victimized by Crossfield schemes. Together, we formed a coalition called Protect Historic Farmland and began attending every county meeting. "These men want to destroy our heritage for profit," I said during public comment periods. "They're using fraud and forgery to steal land that's been in families for generations." The local media picked up the story. Fraud victims fight back against development corruption. Meanwhile, I was working on a more direct approach, using shell companies of my own, completely legal ones. I began purchasing properties adjacent to my father's land. If Brandon wanted to develop a luxury resort, he'd need access roads, utilities, and BUFFR zones. I was systematically buying up everything he'd need, making development impossible even if he managed to keep the stolen land. The properties weren't expensive individually, but together they represented a strategic chokehold on Brandon's entire development plan. By spring, I owned or controlled over 500 acres surrounding my father's original 200-acre farm. Brandon's stolen land was now worthless for development purposes. The zoning board election results came in on a Tuesday night. Maria Santos won by a landslide, and two of Brandon's allies on the board were replaced by environmental advocates. The new board's first action was to vote down the rezoning request for my father's land. This application appears to be based on fraudulent property transfers, Chairwoman Santos announced. "We cannot approve development of illegally obtained land." Brandon's entire scheme was collapsing. But I wasn't finished yet. Using my network of former colleagues and professional contacts, I began spreading word throughout Manhattan's financial community about Brandon's crimes. Not gossip or rumors, documented facts about federal charges, asset seizures, and investor losses. The story spread quickly through the interconnected world of high-end finance. Brandon Cross became a pariah overnight. Former friends stopped returning his calls. Business associates distanced themselves publicly. Even Cynthia Vale, his attorney and lover, quietly withdrew from representing him to protect her own reputation. Brandon was experiencing something he'd never faced before: complete social and professional isolation. I felt no satisfaction in his Sue FF airing, only a cold sense of justice being served. He'd used his charm and connections to build his fraudulent empire. Now those same social networks were destroying him. But the ultimate victory was still ahead of me. I wanted my father's land back in my name, legally and permanently, and I was about to get it through the most poetic means possible. The federal asset forfeiture case moved through the courts with surprising speed. Prosecutors argued that all of Brandon's property, including the shell companies that held my stolen land, had been purchased with proceeds from fraud. Judge Tanner agreed. "The evidence clearly shows a pattern of criminal activity designed to generate illegal profits," he ruled. "All assets connected to this scheme are subject to forfeiture." But here's where my legal preparation paid off. I had standing to claim my father's land as a victim of the original crime. Unlike Brandon's other assets, which would be sold to compensate all his fraud victims, my land could be returned directly to me. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning. Brandon appeared in court looking haggard and desperate, flanked by a public defender since he could no longer afford private counsel. I sat in the gallery with Naomi, Elijah, and my lawyer, watching justice finally unfold. "Your Honor," my attorney began, "Miss Winslow seeks return of property that was stolen from her through document forgery. She has clear title through her father's properly executed will." Brandon's public defender tried to argue that the transfer was legitimate. But Judge Tanner had reviewed all the evidence. "The forensic analysis of the signature is conclusive," he said. "This document was forged. The property transfer is void." Just like that, my father's land was mine again. Brandon stared at me across the courtroom with a mixture of hatred and something that might have been respect. He'd finally realized he'd underestimated me completely. But I still had one final surprise for him. After the hearing, I walked outside into the bright morning sunshine feeling lighter than I had in months. My father's land was legally mine again, protected by conservation easements that would prevent any future development. Brandon emerged from the courthouse a few minutes later, looking lost and defeated. He approached me hesitantly. "Amora, I want you to know. I never meant for things to get this complicated." I studied his face, searching for any sign of genuine remorse. I found none. "You stole my father's life work while pretending to comfort me through grief," I said quietly. "You forged legal documents and built a criminal enterprise. What exactly didn't you mean to get complicated?" I was desperate. The business was failing, investors were asking questions. "So you decided to steal from someone who trusted you." He had no answer for that. "Goodbye, Brandon," I said, walking toward my car. "Wait," he called after me. "What happens now?" I turned back one final time. "Now you face the consequences of your choices. And I rebuild what you tried to destroy." 3 months later, Brandon Cross was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for fraud, forgery, and operating an unlicensed investment scheme. Crossfield Capital was dissolved, its assets distributed among the victims of Brandon's crimes. I used my share of the settlement to establish a legal aid fund for elderly property owners facing predatory development tactics. A year after getting my land back, I stood in the same courthouse where justice had finally been served. But this time, I wasn't there as a victim. I was there as an expert witness in another property fraud case, helping prosecutors convict one of Brandon's former associates who'd continued running similar schemes. My reputation in the legal community had grown substantially. Law firms sought my expertise in complex property disputes. Federal prosecutors consulted me on financial fraud cases. I'd found my true calling, and it was more satisfying than any corporate job I'd ever had. Elijah had become more than just an ally in my fight against Brandon. Over the months of working together, we'd developed a relationship based on mutual respect and shared values. "You're DIFF errant now," he told me one evening as we reviewed case files in my office. "Stronger. More confident." "Brandon took a lot from me," I replied. "But he also showed me what I was capable of when pushed too far." My father's land remained untouched, protected in perpetuity by the conservation trust I'd established. I visited every few months, maintaining the old farmhouse and keeping the property in good condition. Sometimes I'd sit on the front porch and imagine my father's pride in how I'd fought to honor his memory. He'd asked me to protect the land, and I'd done more than that. I'd protected it forever. But my work wasn't finished yet. There were still victims of Brandon's schemes seeking justice, still predatory developers targeting vulnerable families. I had the skills, resources, and motivation to fight them all. 2 years after Brandon's conviction, I received an unexpected phone call. Ron Latimer, the former head of Crossfield's real estate division, was starting his own firm and wanted to hire me as a consultant. "You have the best reputation in the industry for uncovering property fraud," he said. "I'd like to retain your services to ensure all our deals are completely legitimate." I almost laughed. Ron had been Brandon's right-hand man throughout the fraud scheme. Now he wanted to pay me to verify his honesty. "Ron, you do realize I was the one who helped send your former boss to prison? That's exactly why I want to work with you. You're thorough, you're honest, and you're absolutely terrifying to anyone thinking about cutting corners." After some thought, I agreed to take on his company as a client. Not because I trusted Ron, but because working with him gave me access to the entire network of developers and investors who'd enabled Brandon's crimes. Over the following months, I discovered that Brandon's scheme had been even larger than federal investigators realized. Shell companies within shell companies, forged documents stretching back over a decade, millions of dollars in stolen property. I quietly documented everything and passed the information to federal prosecutors. By the end of that year, 12 more people had been indicted for participating in Brandon's criminal enterprise. The real estate development community in New York learned a simple lesson. If you engaged in fraud, Amora Winslow would eventually find you. My reputation became my greatest weapon. Developers started hiring me proactively, not just to investigate fraud but to prevent it. The industry began policing itself rather than risk my scrutiny. 5 years after Brandon's sentencing, I was invited to property fraud affects more than just the immediate victims, I told them. It destroys families, communities, and trust in our legal system. After my presentation, a young prosecutor approached me. Miss Winslow, I wanted to thank you. The Brandon Cross case changed how we investigate financial fraud. Your documentation techniques have become the gold standard. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. My father's stolen land had become the catalyst for systematic reform in how property crimes were prosecuted. That evening, Elijah and I walked through Central Park, discussing plans for the legal aid foundation I'd established with my settlement money. You know what's ironic, he said. Brandon thought he was stealing your future. Instead, he gave you the purpose you were meant to have. He was right. My work fighting fraud and protecting vulnerable property owners had become more meaningful than any corporate career I'd previously imagined. We'd helped dozens of families recover stolen land, sent numerous criminals to prison, and reformed an entire industry's approach to due diligence. But perhaps the greatest victory was personal. I'd proven to myself that I was stronger than I'd ever realized, more resourceful than I'd believed possible, and absolutely unstoppable when fighting for justice. Brandon had underestimated me completely, and that mistake had cost him everything. 10 years later, I stood once again on my father's land, but this time I wasn't alone. My daughter played in the same fields where I'd grown up, chasing butterflies and climbing the old oak tree by the creek. Elijah and I had married 3 years after Brandon's conviction, and we'd built a life together based on shared values rather than shared ambitions. Our daughter, Hope, would inherit the land someday, along with the story of how it had been protected. The old farmhouse had been restored to its original beauty, and we spent summers there, away from the intensity of Manhattan legal work. I'd established my own firm, specializing in property fraud investigation and victim advocacy. We had offices in New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. With a star FF of 20 attorneys and investigators. The Brandon Cross case had made me famous in legal circles, but more importantly, it had shown me the power of systematic, patient justice. I received regular updates on Brandon's prison life through the federal victim notification system. He'd be eligible for parole in 2 more years, assuming good behavior. I felt neither hatred nor satisfaction at his continuing imprisonment. He'd made his choices, and consequences had followed naturally. My focus was entirely on the future, the families I could help, the fraudsters I could stop, the justice I could serve. Brandon Cross had stolen my father's land, but in doing so, he'd given me something far more valuable, a calling that used all my skills in service of protecting others. Last month, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from Brandon, written from federal prison. Amora, it began, I know I have no right to contact you, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I did to you and your family. I've spent years thinking about that land and what it meant to your father. I was wrong to take it, and I'm sorry. The letter went on for several pages, an attempt at explanation, justification, and ultimately, genuine remorse. I read it once, then filed it away. Brandon's regret didn't change what he'd done. But it confirmed something I'd always believed: even the most corrupt people are capable of recognizing their mistakes. Whether that recognition led to genuine reform was another question entirely. Today, as I write this story, my father's land remains exactly as he would have wanted it, undeveloped, protected, and cherished by his family. The Conservation Trust ensures it will stay that way forever, no matter what future pressures might arise. Brandon Cross learned the hard way that some things can't be stolen, forged, or manipulated. Integrity, determination, and the power of righteous anger channeled through legal expertise. He thought he could take my inheritance and my future. Instead, he gave me the motivation to become someone far stronger than I'd ever been before. Sometimes the best revenge isn't hurting your enemies, it's becoming so successful that their attacks become the foundation of your greatest achievements. My father would be proud of the woman his land helped me become.